Hey folks, Fernando doing another video for the Modern Survivalist, and in this case doing a brief history presentation of the Bowie knife. Now, there's been books written about this, there's thousands of videos about it, documentaries, YouTube clips are fantastic, full of information. This is just going to be a very brief explanation of what the Bowie knife is, what's regarding all the confusion around it as well, because you probably heard Bowie knife 1,000 times, especially if you watch this channel, if you're anything of a knife enthusiast, and you probably assume that these are all some kind of Bowie knife, right? But where does this all come from? Of course, James Bowie, the original wielder of the Bowie knife, giving that his name. But did he really design the Bowie himself? No. Which was the knife that made him famous? And what is the implication of all of this for knife culture and knife designs in general? So, first of all, nothing here is matter of fact. Very few facts regarding James Bowie in terms of his knife, because there's been several different models, there's been several accounts, sometimes contradicting one another. So pretty much all of it is not written in stone. It is all very much estimations depending on different accounts. So it's very little that we actually know for sure 100%. Of course, there's things we're a little bit more certain of than others, but we'll go through that in this video. Also, one more thing, none of it is original in terms of anything of this being created or being original to either James Bowie or James Black, who is the guy that actually ended up making some of the more notorious Bowie knives, all right? So where does the fame of the Bowie knife start from? Of course, in what's known as a sandbar fight. So they basically fought in a sandbar. It was a duel in which James Bowie was with his group of people and the participant of the duel and the other group and the other guy he was confronting. Basically, the duel itself ended up having, was a no issue. They ended up pretty much according not to fight, or basically ended without bloodshed. But the groups ended up getting in a fight among each other, and that's where the fight started and where James Bowie was basically wounded, shot, stabbed. I think he was shot like a couple times. He was stabbed as well with one of these canes, the sword canes, the very narrow blade, a thrust to his chest. I believe he was even hit in the solar plexus, but it didn't go through the bone. But he was stabbed a couple times then. He was shot, he was kicked, punched, and basically he ended up in the ground attacked by different people. He got up, brought out his Bowie knife and started slashing away, killed the guy that stabbed him and wounded another, and basically was seriously hurt in this fight, but ended up surviving, recovering months later, and history was then written. That fight became very famous. Keep in mind the historic context. There was no internet, there was no news, TV, nothing. We're talking about 1827 when this fight took place, and in that moment it did make to the headlines of the local news and then became a widespread topic of discussion, the way in which James Bowie ended up using a large butcher knife so as to defend himself and fight. And that's what attracted most attention, especially in a period of time where firearms were already being used and was already something that most people would end up using mostly in some of these fights. But the way in which a knife basically was used to kill someone that was attacking this person with a firearm, and also the context of in several parts of the world at that time. For example, in Latin America and South America, where I'm from, in Argentina, gauchos would fight with knives all day long. It was not newsworthy. It was the most typical thing for people to do, especially gauchos, which are the equivalent of like a cowboy, but instead of having a gun, they would have a knife. They would have a big facon knife, which is basically a big blade, not all that different from what a Bowie knife would be. Maybe a little more narrow and more intended as a fighting knife, made out of broken swords, bayonets, sometimes even machetes. But not to digress, the idea is that fight made James Bowie famous. James Bowie was already a guy of a certain notoriety. He was somewhat of an adventurer, somewhat of an investor, somewhat of a haggler, street smart type of guy, and his family itself was a little bit of the of renown, let's put it that way, in the region. Now, which was the knife that was actually used in the sandbar fight? Well, we don't have any pictures of that, but we have several accounts. And basically, most accounts agree it was just a big butcher's blade. It had a very classic butcher knife shape. It had a very straight back, a straight spine. It was about, some accounts say 9.5, some say even 12 inches. Most likely it was something very similar to this, like a 12-inch blade, 1.5 inches across, and with a basic wooden handle with a few rivets in there. Not having this part, basically, would be something like this. This would have been the knife, according to most accounts, that James Bowie ended up using. Now, this knife that he used in the famous fight that made him famous was not of his own. It was given to him by his brother Razin Bowie, who also has his own interpretations of Bowie knives, but it was Razin's knife which gave the knife to James for the fight. Specifically giving that they maybe didn't trusting firearms as much as you would these days. Calibers were not as powerful as some of the ones you have these days. So there was this idea of, okay, I'll have a big knife, a big hunting knife, a big butcher knife, and this is going to be my weapon for self-defense if things go wrong in this fight. And the knife handed to James by Razin was actually made not by James Black, but by Jesse Clift, who's the original blacksmith who's made that Bowie knife. Years later, and here's where things start getting a little bit more muddy, but I'm pretty certain that this is likely to be true, the history about the Forrest Bowie, which goes this way. James Bowie was someone that wanted to have notoriety. He wanted to be famous. He wanted to be well recognized. And one of the things that most likely ended up having, according to different accounts, say that there was this friendship between a famous actor of the era, stage actor known as Edwin Forrest, and James Bowie. He ended up giving Forrest his knife, the one that he ended up using in the sandbar fight. Years later, display of different weapons from Forrest was discovered or rediscovered, and one of the knives that was discovered there was a Forrest Bowie knife, which is again very similar to this, except for this part, just a simple knife, well-made knife. It was tested and seems to be accurate in terms of materials to the place and time in which the original Bowie knife was made. So according to most analysis, it does belong to that era, and some people say that Forrest was actually, just trying to become famous or get more fame, making up an association with James Bowie that never actually existed. Some say that that's actually not true, that Forrest was already well famous on his own account, and different anecdotal evidence, the amount of which keeps on piling up, and there's different accounts of that. There's even a portrait in which James Bowie was actually portrayed with a knife very similar to the Forrest Bowie knife. So all of that, at least in my opinion, that would be a pretty accurate account. But even on the description of witnesses of that fight, this is where you would look at if you're looking for the original real Bowie knife that actually made James Bowie famous, and even famous as a knife fighter, even though that was the only well accounted for fight. There was a couple others, but there's really not that much trust in the accuracy of those. It's supposedly he fought 3 attackers, 3 assailants with firearms and killed the 3 of them. There's really not the amount of evidence as to support that as you have from the sandbar fight, which would be the only one which we're pretty sure of, actually took place, because it ended up making the news, headlines, lots of witnesses. That moment was pretty crucial for James in becoming very famous, and he later ended up contacting blacksmith known as James Black from Arkansas, and in 1830 he ended up having a knife made for him. From the moment of the fight, James Bowie became pretty famous, and especially his knife became famous. People were interested in that, and he would have knife commissions to different manufacturers, him and his brother, and would give those away as gifts, selling them, whatever. It became a thing for him to be associated with the knife like Bowies, right? So when he ended up contacting and getting in touch with James Black, he had a wooden knife design of his. Now, James Black did that design that James Bowie presented to him and did one of his own design, which had the more famous clip point. James Bowie ended up going with Black's design and liking that and sticking with that. And from that moment on, James Black became famous and started doing a very successful business making knives like Bowie's, right? That was what people asked for. I want a knife like Bowie's. There was also, it became such a big thing that different companies started making knives like Bowie's as well. Specifically in England, Sheffield started making the typical clip point shaped Bowie blade. Now, there's also knives made by his brother Razin, different interpretations, and some of the knives that maybe this is a more classic, trying to put a little bit of sense to all of this. Some of the things we know for sure. None of this is original or any new enlightening of the knife design and creation. All of this pretty much has been done before, all right? It's specifically the classic old style butcher's knife is as popular as it ever was, and it was back then. Even the clip point blade, even the guard, all of these things had been incorporated to knives centuries ago, but they became more notorious because of the famous sandbar fight. It became very ridiculous to a point in which it was banned in Texas to have a Bowie knife, even though no one can pinpoint exactly what a Bowie knife actually is, because there's different interpretations of that. And maybe the one that people least associated with would be the original one that was used in the actual fight that gained such a reputation for Bowie knives as being horrible, terrible weapons which even a child can wield and cause slaughter. This would be, if you think it of in modern times, this would be like the assault rifle or the assault gun, that negative connotation of he has an assault rifle. Well, back in the day, he had a Bowie knife. You have to be a madman or a criminal to have a Bowie knife. That's why it was directly banned. Until recently, Bowie knives were banned in Texas. But the design that we most associate with would be somewhat of the James Black, the Sheffield type of Bowie blade. Now, it got to a point where some of these knives ended up being just very short, little knives, like a 5-inch, 6-inch blade. The Forest Bowie and the first interpretation of the sandbar fight Bowie knife would be like a 9.5, even 12-inch. This would be like a 12-inch blade, 1.5 across. Some of the knives commissioned and that actually James Bowie did in fact give to people were very close to what later ended up being discovered and known as the Musso Bowie knife. The Musso Bowie knife is shrouded in a little bit of mystery. I believe there's a good case for it though. As most of you probably know, James Bowie ended up dying in El Alamo, where the Mexican forces surrounded. Keep in mind all of this territory dispute. By then, there was all Mexico. A big chunk of what now is the United States was, in fact, Mexico back in the day, and different fights ended up redrawing all of that map. But it is very well known the fact of El Alamo, the last stand, they fight 300 guys against 1,500 Mexican soldiers surrounded. I think it went on for like 11-15 days. Don't remember exactly how long it went, but basically that is where James Bowie ends up dying, and he died with a knife. He had, keep in mind, there's a good chance that his first one ended up going to Edwin Forrest. A few others probably were going away as gifts as well. But this is, in theory, the one that he ends up having last, the Musso Bowie. What is the Musso Bowie? Well, this is actually a replica of that knife made by Windlass, and it's actually quite accurate. It is a very big knife. I think it's like 12 inches, maybe 13 inches, and almost like a couple inches across. Very big, and it has this this brass strip on the spine, which in theory is intended to catch blades. I actually tried it because I was curious, and in fact, when you give it a little bit of an impact with the sharp edge of a steel knife, it does dig in quite deep. So yeah, there is something to be said about this, maybe being successful to a point for catching and avoiding the attacker's knife from slipping. So the story goes that, of course, we know this is in fact, this is a fact, not much of a story. James Bowie ends up dying in El Alamo, and the knife is then lost. Years later, an old piece of Mexican furniture ends up getting lost. Remember, Mexican territory back in the day, so a piece of Mexican furniture ends up getting sold, and in that antique piece of furniture, this knife, well, the original version of this knife, the Musso Bowie, ends up being found. Yeah, it's called the Musso Bowie because the guy that ends up getting it, I think it's Jack Musso. Basically, Musso is his last name. So they find this knife, and of course, the first thing they think of, man, this is an old Bowie knife, you know, because they knew that much. And once they clean it up, they find the initials JB, supposedly James Bowie, in the knife. Tests are done, and the materials do put it about in that same period of time when supposedly it may have been made by someone in Arkansas, which, yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, would be the place in which was in theory being made, and pretty much the lab tests put it in that place, and it seems to be an accurate, it's not a replica, it seems to be an actual original knife. And for a lot of people, that may well be the last knife that James Bowie ended up wielding himself. And yeah, well, again, a pretty accurate replica by Windlass. These are made in Pakistan. They're really not all that expensive, and I just was curious about it. It handles awfully. It's really not, I mean, I see completely why this would be a better fighting knife and why it was successful. Of course, this is a big knife, so it's going to be chopping like an axe. This has a very narrow tip, and man, anyone getting close to this, it would be very easy to cause a horrible wound by stabbing. I don't know if the original one is actually sharpened. This one is not, but in any case, big clip point, big blade, heavy as well. Bit of an unwieldy thing, but for the character of James Bowie, I absolutely see why he would have something ridiculous like this in his belt, you know, because the first thing anyone would have looked at when they see the guy was look at if he has a knife and what knife he has, and maybe even, hey, can I take a look at your knife? And sure, and he brings this out, and everyone goes like, whoa, that's impressive. So I think it kind of makes sense and lines up with what it would likely be original. Anyway, I find it fascinating that the original knife used in the fight was completely different from what we today understand is a Bowie knife, and how even today, like a 5-inch little blade, if it has a guard and a clip point, someone will slap their Bowie knife and, you know, it's all good. Very fascinating history. As I was saying before, I'm trying to keep this video short. In any case, what are the implications for all of this? Even though none of this is, you know, any kind of knife design revolution, it did mark a period of time in history, especially in American history, and therefore in the way knife designs have evolved since then, especially in the United States. This ended up being one of the things that people would look at in terms of a big fighting knife, of a chopper, of a fighter, or of even a utilitarian knife to a point. And even till this day, you have the K-bar strongly influenced by this, clip points, you know, even though it's not as big, clip points, guard, later on the famous Rambo knives, and even if you follow that line, you end up in the M9 bayonet used today by the US Armed Forces. And that is a topic for another video, which I'm going to be wasting a lot of your time there as well. But guys, basically this is my brief history of the Bowie knife. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, dude. We are almost at 61K subscribers. I'd like to have that number reach 100K like in my Spanish channel. So subscribe if you haven't done so already. Much appreciated. I'll leave a few links below in case I find something that you may believe, you may find interesting from what's available in Amazon, from the affiliate program, of course. But yeah, that's it, guys. See you on our next video. Have an awesome day.